Welcome to Channel's Business Globe with me, Juliana Olayinka, reporting from just outside the Palace of Westminster in central London. Coming up on today's show, the fallout from the UK's long-running Pakistani grooming gang scandal has reignited fierce debate on race, policing and the protection of vulnerable children. Just this week, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer's government launched a national statutory inquiry following years of campaigning by survivors and whistleblowers. I'll be discussing the political fallout with our Downing Street correspondent Simon Pusey, and later in the programme I sit down with leading barrister Dr. Jennifer Obaseki, who unpacks the implications for race relations, community trust in law enforcement and the way forward for victim protection. And the Lagos Calabar Coastal Highway project is back in the spotlight, while the billion-dollar initiative is hailed as a critical step toward boosting regional trade and infrastructure. Correlating land seizures and residential demolition have triggered controversy, raising concerns about displacement, compensation and due process. I'll be speaking with Dr. Stephen Akintayo, real estate developer and chairman of GTEX Holdings, to get his take on investor confidence in Lagos and whether the region remains a viable investment hub amidst heightened scrutiny. But first, we begin with the 2025 King's Birthday Honours List. This year, London Mayor Sadiq Khan receives a knighthood for services to local government and public life, becoming one of the highest-ranking selected officials from a minority background to be so honoured. Football icon David Beckham has also been knighted, recognised for his contributions to sport and global philanthropy, including his ongoing work with UNICEF. Other recipients include Dr. Funke Abimbola, recognised for her leadership in healthcare, law and diversity advocacy, and Irenesun Okoji, the British-Nigerian author, awarded an MBE for her contributions to literature and inclusion in publishing. Elsewhere, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer has just returned to London after attending the G7 summit in Ottawa. Starmer and Canadian PM Mark Carney unveiled a new UK-Canada Economic and Trade Working Group tasked with delivering concrete recommendations on tariff reductions, digital trade frameworks, critical minerals cooperation, semiconductors and AI infrastructure within 6 months. Canada also confirmed it will ratify the UK's accession to the CPTPP later this year, unlocking seamless trade across 9 Asia-Pacific economies. Meanwhile, ongoing UK-US trade discussions have yielded a memorandum of understanding aimed at a broader economic prosperity deal, covering digital trade, supply chains and economic security. In the shorter term, both governments have agreed to reduce car tariffs for up to 100,000 vehicles annually, zero out steel and aluminium tariffs, and improve market access for beef and ethanol. However, those changes await formal implementation by both administrations. And now to one of the most divisive public debates in Britain in recent memory, the UK's Pakistani grooming gang scandal. Just this week, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer's government launched a national statutory inquiry following years of campaigning by survivors and whistleblowers. The issue has resurfaced following fresh investigative reports into historical failures by police and local authorities to protect victims, many of them working-class white girls who were exploited by grooming gangs across northern England. Critics say political correctness and racial sensitivities led to years of silence during which vulnerable children were trafficked and abused. Others argue that the blanket criminalisation of British Pakistani men risks reinforcing damaging racial stereotypes and stoking far-right sentiment. Well, for a deeper insight, I caught up with our Downing Street correspondent Simon Pusey. Simon, so before we gauge your reaction on the reactions following the grooming gang scandal inquiry, let's talk about Sir Keir Starmer on the international stage, where he appears to be getting some praise. He came back from Canada with a deal on the Pacific trade and also new terms under this US-UK trade deal.
Yeah, I think he's managing to play the Donald Trump versus the other world leaders game quite well.
Yeah.
I think even he admits he doesn't really understand why Donald Trump likes him, but Donald Trump says a lot that he does like him.
Yes.
Which just seems like a weird parallel universe. But he seems to be...
he's a great man.
Playing that quite well, exactly, yeah. Great people. He seems to be playing that quite well, where he's sort of got, Emmanuel Macron, European leaders on the one hand, and then Donald Trump, and they don't always see eye to eye, but he seems to be able to sort of play that kind of diplomatic dance quite well. He obviously has had this small trade deal. You know, it's not a blockbuster thing, but it's
I mean,
quite
not
good.
clear on the terms.
No, but it's quite good to go, I guess, to a G7 meeting and have an announcement. There's that quite memorable picture of him picking up the leaflets that Donald Trump dropped.
Before he
or
ran
the
away.
main thing. Yeah, exactly. Him bending down to pick them up, which is quite symbolic of,
Yes.
you know, anything you want, President.
Yep.
But he seems to have done quite well. The deal itself, you're right, it's quite sketchy. We don't really know what's in it. And there's a lot of things that aren't in it that people would have wanted UK steel. But he's got, you know, a few deals on car issues. So I think it's like
Better than nothing.
The wins are coming in for Sir Keir Starmer in a
Okay.
way that maybe a couple of months ago we would have thought Donald Trump would be hating him, would be hating a lack of free speech, a lefty leader in the UK telling him what to do. I think the wins are sort of coming in for Sir Keir Starmer and the Labour Party on the international stage and the world stage. Even if, you know, things back home are not going swimmingly in terms of his ratings, for example, here,
I wanna
he seems
talk
to be
about
doing
that.
well, you know, abroad.
Doing well abroad, not doing so well here. On Monday, there was the announcement that there was going to be a statutory inquiry, which was announced by Yvette Cooper on this grooming gang scandal. We've spoken about it over successive years on this channel, but if you can briefly just remind us what that is about, why it's so politically divisive.
Yeah, I mean, so for decades, grooming gangs up and down the UK and cities up and down the UK have been operating, and there were accusations that this was largely Pakistani based, or there was an ethnic a minority sort of reason, or there was more of a push for ethnic minorities that were behind this. And for decades the government was saying that wasn't the case. And more recently it's turned out that if you look into the details, that yes, there was more of a Pakistani base of people that were behind
In
this.
Pakistani areas.
Yes,
Which
yes,
is
exactly.
which is an important point to make, isn't it?
And there's been a full report that has recently been published by Baroness Casey, who says that the authorities, there wasn't necessarily a cover-up, but authorities were keen to not point this out.
They were scared. They were scared that they'd be called racist.
And sections of the political establishment have been asking for this for a while, and the Conservatives have jumped on this and said that
Kemi Badenoch was really angry.
Yes, and I think she's trying to take ownership of this issue, to have an issue that is hers.
Yeah, we discussed that last week. She's got one.
She's saying that this is a disgrace and that Sir Keir Starmer should apologise for not holding one already, not having a public inquiry already. You know, the Labour people could say, well, look, the Conservatives were in power for 12 years and you did nothing.
But the heart of the matter is the white working class girls, isn't it? You know, white working class Britain once again being left to rot. That is kind of the political sentiment that's being pushed by the far right. Some would say they've got a point.
Yeah, and I think, you know, this is probably where Reform do pretty well as well, because they're all about that, right? They're all about, you know, borders, immigration. Don't forget about the native people here. But I think Sir Keir Starmer is saying that it's because Baroness Casey recommended a public inquiry into this, and that's why he's doing it now, is because he's putting into practice her report. But I think a lot of people would say, you know, the horse has already bolted, you should have done this a while ago, and you're sort of playing catch up now. And, you know, I guess it is at least, it's a long time coming, but for the victims of this, at least they are going to get, it looks like the political establishment are listening finally, and they will get a full inquiry, and they will hear some answers. Lots of people have been jailed, but for decades people have been abused. Like you say, white working class girls have been abused, and for decades no one in the place behind us seems to have cared.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to be speaking about that with my next guest, and we'll see what the inquiry unveils. Thanks, Simon. And now to legal expert and community advocate Dr. Jennifer Obaseki to examine the broader impact on race relations. So, Dr. Jennifer Obaseki, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. After years of what many would describe as inaction, early this week the Labour Party announced that there would now be a statutory inquiry into the grooming gang scandal. I have spoken about the scandal for years on this show, but only now the government have decided to tackle it. What is your reaction and your response? I know you've dealt with this over the years.
It's nice to have the KC report, but in all honesty, there's the distraction of this word ethnic gangs, and that gives me a lot of concern.
Why?
It gives me concern because
they're Pakistani men.
Yes, but the majority of men in that region are Pakistani.
Yeah.
So any particular area will have pedophiles, or let me say gang members or criminals of a particular representation of its environment. So I don't want people to get lost in the ethnic gang phraseology. Every victim is important and every perpetrator must be pursued, not focusing on their ethnicity, every single one. The majority of people who commit sexual offences against children are Caucasian men. That's the starting point. The fact that the police failed and the social services workers and social workers failed to take accurate statistics. Only 30%, I think, of the reported ethnic backgrounds were recorded. That's an omission by the police. Those failings cannot be overlooked. But what we must not do is start to target individual ethnic groups rather than looking at the problem of sexual offenders as a whole.
That's quite interesting, Dr. Jennifer, and a lot of people share that sentiment with you, a lot of people. And some would say that's the reason why this case was buried for years, because people say, oh no, let's not focus on the ethnicity. The ethnicity is at the heart of this case. Some would say, do you understand that? In terms of the audit and the inquiry, the initial inquiry, it was that they were Pakistani men.
I believe that there was the worry about disturbing racial sensitivities.
Yes.
However, every victim is important,
Yeah.
not just Caucasian victims.
Yeah.
All of the victims had one synonymous issue, which is the class. They felt these are young girls from lower class backgrounds who have social troubles, and their voices were not heard. But that's the same across the country. There are young black girls in London whose voices in the 80s were overheard, that were victims of gangs of different other ethnic groups. And I don't want to see everything or every effort being lost along racial lines. Do we start to just look at Pakistani perpetrators? We need to look at all perpetrators, is my point.
I think one of the reasons why this has become so politically toxic, not just on X, but also behind us in the Palace of Westminster, is because there is a lot of cultural clashing in the UK at the moment,
Yes.
in populist nations. In fact, in the global north, a lot of people are talking about identity politics. What are your thoughts about identity politics in the UK at the moment? Are you worried that this is going to stir up even
Racial
more of that?
hatred.
Yes.
I believe that there are some factions in the UK at the moment that feel that stirring and disturbing racial sensitivities may get them votes. And they're basically picking on issues within society and blaming migrants. So it's basically following that trend. And that's unfortunate, because what that means is the voice of many victims of abuse and other issues will be lost, because people will be looking at race rather than substance. And we all want safe neighborhoods, we all want to have access to housing, but if you start now looking at dividing attention along racial lines, we're not going to solve those issues for everybody, which is the sad thing.
Why do you think Sir Keir Starmer decided to U-turn? Another week, another U-turn. Do you think it is the fear of reform, or do you think there's something
It's
deeper?
unfortunate. If he had looked at this case and said, okay, these victims were overlooked, there were failings by the police, I'm going to look at where the gaps were. Over the years, why have victims of sexual abuse or sexual exploitation not been looked at? Why have the police failed in gathering the sensitive data that they should have?
Yeah.
We would have said, okay, he's seen the failings, he's listening to the victims, but it took a billionaire on the other side of the Atlantic to say that there's a problem here, for him to now come and look at it again. It also, sadly, is an issue where the victims also had lobbied Labour before they came into power, and promises probably made.
Yeah.
And him realising that he couldn't yet, let them down, and with the on charge from reform, thought, let me do something that will get me a few ticks. I don't believe that he has really had a good think about how else he can better protect victims of sexual abuse. How else can he better protect women and girls who are suffering in this country? Instead, it took this inquiry. But the Casey report, I must say, has highlighted the problem across the country.
Yeah.
So what I would love to see him do is make sure that this statutory review doesn't just look at what happened in the North Midlands and in Rotherham, not just Yorkshire and Bristol, but also what's happened in London.
Coming up on Channel's Business Global, the Lagos-Calabar Coastal Highway project is back in the spotlight. I speak with Dr. Stephen Akintayo, real estate developer and chairman of GTEX Holdings, to get his take on investor confidence and whether Lagos remains a viable investment hub amidst heightened scrutiny. See you after the break.